Welcome back again to another video on the series of Caro Kann. Today we'll be looking at another Caro Kann, but this time it is not going to be the main line. It's going to be the side line with pawn to h4. While the side line isn't really played a lot in the over-the-board tournament, especially in classical time control, it is especially very famous in the online events and or the rapid and blitz time control. It is rather obvious that this opening is designed to keep people out of the pace and caught them off guard. Now the idea is very simple. If black follows through with pawn to e6, then this is actually a blunder. Pawn to g4 and then pawn to h5 traps the bishop. You might think there's a bishop to e4, but then, pawn to f3, you're just basically trapped. So the most conventional way to play against this is to play pawn to h5. You want to control the square on g4. You don't want to let your opponent play g4 in the near future. You can, if you wanted to, play h6, but this falls short to the move pawn to g4 in the near future. In the next 2-3 moves probably. I'm not going to talk about that because I don't believe in h6, but h5 is the stuff that we should be looking about because this is the most common line to reply against. Again, the main idea of this side line is to play bishop to d3 to trade down the strong bishop from black, and after the trade like this, black usually plays pawn to e6. This is important because if he doesn't play pawn to e6, let's say play knight to d7, then e6 comes, and with that is a checkmate if the pawn is taken on e6. So a dangerous line if you're not careful about it. What I want to do here is to play pawn to e6. Now back in this line, bishop to e3 is not necessary at all. You can play bishop to e2, you can slow play this with knight to f3. But usually in this position, we ignore the pawn on h5. We still play pawn to e6, the important move that we talk about. Yeah, the bishop can take on h5 if it wants to. But then with that, we have the open h-file. We can bring our knight to f5, target this pawn later. We can start with pawn to c5 first. We're most welcome to play on the queen side with queen to b6 or queen to a5 later on as well, and ignore the pawn fully on the king side since the rook is already open and is already developed. Now after this has resolved, you have your pawn chain that controls the light squares and your minor pieces that will be poised to control the dark squares in the future. The most common way and also the most aggressive way to continue for white is to play bishop to g5. This is true from the intermediate player all the way to the grandmaster level. So this is something that we have to look into. Against this bishop g5, there are several ways to do this. We can play knight to e7, but that's basically pinning down yourself to the queen. I myself like to play queen to a5 and also queen to b6. We'll look at them each one by one. And so the move queen to a5 check is also something that grandmasters has played a lot as well. And I'll tell you what we really want. We really want our opponent to play pawn to c3, and after that queen to a6 and trade the queens away. Problem is, if the queen moves to, let's say, d1, then we control the long diagonal. The queen is undeveloping herself, and so this might not be the good move for white to go to. And obviously, the queen can come back to e2, but it does stay on the same diagonal. We can trade down later. We can even start with pawn to f6 first. And after that, maybe begin with the knight to e7 and king to f7, things like that. Otherwise, it's a pain to have this queen on this diagonal, and so more often than not, if white has this kind of position, they always trade it down, but we have our knight already developed here. Next move, we can even play pawn to c5 in this position, break down the center of the board. It's even better if they take, we just break down the center of the board and also develop our piece towards the center of the board, which is something that is really good, principally speaking. But obviously, not everything goes into our way. In this position, there are 3 to 4 ways to defend, but the only bad way to defend against this position is to play queen to c3. Obviously, the queen is facing each other, so protected by the knight as well. So trading is cool, but bishop to b4 ends the party, and white loses the game quite immediately. There's no way to defend. The queen is pinned to the king, and yeah, it's forced to sacrifice itself. So any move is fine. We talked about pawn to c3 earlier. We haven't talked about knight to d2, but I can play knight to d2. Obviously, the bishop can come to d2 as well in this position, bishop to d2. But more often than not, this is undeveloping his own piece, and so a lot of people will play knight to d2, protecting against a check. But also in this position, after queen to a6 in his position, white will play pawn to c4. Now the difference is with pawn to c4 here, there's a knight that is supporting the pawn, and so trading the queen won't be so easy right now. However, we're still not out of the woods. We play bishop to b4 in this position, pinning down the knight to the king, and so we can just take the pawn here without any worries. Obviously, white can also defend that with pawn to b3. defending the c4 pawn nicely, where we now have to find our way to break through. Now that it's come to this, I myself like to play pawn to c5 just to break out the center of the board so we can have more counterplay later on, but obviously white can ignore the plan and go for knight to f3 in this position, just developing a piece, normal, then we just don't give up. We control with knight to c6, attacking the center of the board. And here white can first castle on the king's side, but we're not going to castle, we're waiting for the move of pawn to f6, so after we take, we'll have a mass, kind of pawn center on the board, while the bishop is going to be chased around. Our king is just going to be okay on the center of the board, or sometimes we can also castle on the queen side, depending on what the position transpire into. But in general, we don't castle on the king side and waiting for the pawn move of pawn to f6. Anyway, I digress. The only reason that we can't play pawn to f6 here is because queen to g6. There's always this kind of threat that, I don't really like. Probably if the queen is traded away, then yeah, obviously pawn to f6 become much stronger, but the queen is always eyeing the g6 square, and henceforth we really want to trade off the queen as fast as possible. Now from here, black can play a lot of developing move, one of which is to play knight to e7. White can choose to take the pawn on c5, in which we take with the bishop, and we try to bring the rook to d8. So something like pawn to c4, let's say knight to c4 and rook to d8, or the other way around will be nice to play. And if anybody is going to feel uncomfortable with the queen here on a6, it does feel a bit awkward, and it does feel like the queen has no place after being rejected of a queen trade. Well, I guess you can make an argument that the queen is still controlling the center of the board, the light squares, but it just doesn't feel enough right now. And I might agree, for some people it might be very difficult to untangle all these pieces here that is on the queen side, kind of stepping on each other's toes. That is why in this position, queen to a6 may not be the only move that is available right now. We mentioned that if your opponent plays pawn to c3, it is better to play queen to a6 because we want to trade away the queen so that the g6 square won't come under the pressure if we play pawn to f6 and expand our pawn center down the road. Alright, we'll see the sample line. Let's say queen to a6, knight a6, and after knight to d2, let's say, we can play pawn to c5. Well, black can ignore that with pawn to a3. Obviously, we talk about taking as well here on c5, but again, white can ignore that, pawn to a3. Here we can just play pawn takes d4, and already here pawn to f6, in which we can slowly maneuver our pieces and claim that we have a fairly good center and we won't lose this pretty easily. But again, the world is in our oyster. There are several ways to defend against this. If knight to d2 is played, which is currently the best move, we do not have to play queen to a6. In this position, we can just break with pawn to c5 if we wanted to. It is still possible. Idea, obviously, if d takes c5, then bishop comes out, controlling the center of the board. That's pretty cool. Sample line might see something like knight to f3, knight c6, castle, bishop back to e7, trying to trade on the bishop on g5 as well. And when the bishop doesn't really move, we can take it on our own and develop our piece with something like knight to e7, knight to f5, and probably castle with g6 in the future. That's also very possible. Either way, from here on out, you're just trying to play chess and trying to depend on your creativity and not blunder your pieces away and win the game. But all in all, should be easier way to play against this knight to d2. The other way to handle this is to play queen to b6, another subtle way to handle this. But the idea is, since the bishop has moved from this diagonal, it's not protecting b2 anymore. And so I want to take the pawn on b2 and my chances is right. But again, it is definitely not now. Again, white can take his time to build on the center of the board with knight to d2, knight to c3. But you can't take on b2 as you wish because rook to b1. Again, the rook protected by the knight. Attacking the queen can move, take another pawn, but after rook takes on b7, again have a look at the development on white. There are 4 pieces being developed, while white has 1 stranded queen on the opponent's territory that is not attended, and the other minor pieces and major pieces are all on the first rank. And so this is not good at all. If there's anything that we should learn from the playlist and from the video that we've seen in the Caro Kann, it is that black needs to strive for the development first and attack secondly. And so this ain't nice, but there's one way to play against this, and that is again pawn to c5. Again, if pawn to c4 here happens, you can in this particular moment take on b2. The reasoning is that after rook to b1, you don't have to take on a2, you don't have to escape. You can play queen takes d4, and this time you're trying to trade down the queen, which is the major attacker in this particular moment. and or this line. Obviously, if you trade, then the pawn will be a major nuisance in the position, with nobody being able to kick it away. Not easy at all. Probably you can argue with knight to b3 as white, you can take away this pawn, but all is too late. Bishop to b4 check, and then after that, let's say the king moves to f1, you can protect it with this, and upon that, knight to c6. So it's not that easy to protect at all, and it's just going to be a nuisance in white's position. With that said, white usually wants to avoid the exchanges. Usually he plays something like queen to f3 and or queen to a3. So something like queen to f3, for example. You can play pawn to b6. First is to protect your pawn against the assault of the rook, and after that, think of a plan of knight to c6, knight to d7, and so on. Either way, this position should be easy to play if you focus on developments such as knight to e7, knight to f5, and so on. And so only on pawn to c4 will you be able to play queen takes b2 and queen takes d4. Obviously, when you play something like pawn to c3, it is not possible to take on d4. So only when you can take on d4, only when you can take on d4 will you be able to take on b2 first. And because of that, you're going to be able to win at least 3 pawns for all the development that white has over here. Now this is some great compensation, but also it is going to be very complicated. In this particular moment, let's say if white plays knight to e2 to block the check, now black has to play pawn to b6 to protect against the assault of the rook. Same thing. But then white can play bishop to f4 first, attacking the queen, since it's protected by the knight. The queen comes to f5, for example. Then you have the following position where the bishop takes on b8, and the queen can snoop the pawn on a7. And on interest, attacking the rook on b8. The bishop obviously can solve the problem with that, but everything is too late when the rook comes slamming down on b6, and black doesn't have too much development ready. This can end up in a draw and a repetition, but if you want to play on, it's usually going to take a very difficult time when black has finished development with rook to e8, rook to c8, and so on. And so, everything is a possibility from here. Just don't get mated. Either way, we talk about if pawn to c3 happens, we don't go and take on b2, but what we can do instead is to play knight to c6, something like knight to e7 also possible. If not knight to c6, you want to open up the c file, that's also very possible. Pawn takes d4, pawn takes d4 maybe. But in the end of the day, it's just going to be difficult to take on b2 due to the counterplay of rook to b1. We don't want that really. Oh, there's one more thing that I forgot to mention, is that if white plays knight to f3 in this position, already here knight to b4 harassing the queen is possible, where if queen to b3 is played. Then we got queen to a6. Now this actually again comes as a thorn to actually stop white from castling. So it's just some of these small elements that can really make a difference in the game that you have to pay attention to. If the knight is on e2, maybe you can't do that, but if the knight is on f3 and nothing is protecting against the side squares, then queen to a6 is a perfect move to play. Idea is obviously white cannot castle in this moment, probably forced to bring knight to g1 and e2 again, or maybe knight to b1 and then c3, but either way it cannot be good for white to play. The engine suggested king to d1. I don't want to continue this evaluation no more because, I don't know, it's just very difficult to play against this. Knight to d3 as the next move, and it can't be nice for white to play. So the correct move is to play knight to e2 in this position, where if knight to b4, you can play queen to a3, and queen to a6 isn't really that a problem anymore, because even if white cannot castle due to the fact that the knight probably will be hanging, you can still play some, not castle, but rook h3, so that the knight won't come to d3, controlling the position that way. I'm not sure if this is comfortable for white to play, but we should be good if playing with black. But then the same thing, queen cannot take on b2 because rook to b1, you can take on d4 because knight is protecting it. And so in this position, maybe you can play something like pawn takes d4 and the knight to d4. You can develop like this, like normal, and play chess. Although now looking at my notes, you can see that if pawn to a5 happen in this position, the knight can surely take, but there's a trick that white is trying to go for, and that is knight takes on e6. The thing is, after the pawn takes on e6, queen g6 comes again, and this may be too much because, the knight can't move, it's protecting the bishop, and the bishop can't move because it's pinned against the king, and this probably will be some problem for black to handle. But other way, you can take with the queen, where after the exchange, everything is just fine, it seems like a normal position, and everything goes on from there. It depends on the creativity of both players. And so yeah, these are all the lines that we want to talk about in the Caro Kann today. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully you can, integrate this particular position and all the pattern into your mind and into your games when you play Caro Kann as white and or as black. If you like the video, please consider pressing like button and also the subscribe button to support the channel. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.